Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, and on today's episode of the Afternoon Light podcast, I'm talking to Paul Morrissey, who's the president of Campion College, Australia's first liberal arts college. And Paul lectures in theology there when he's not busy being the president. He has also completed a doctorate at the Catholic Institute in Sydney or a licentiate in sacred theology at the Lateran University in Rome, which I understand is the Pope's University, Paul. So it must have been a fantastic experience, although I understand you didn't spend much time in Rome, which is a bit disappointing.
That's correct, Georgina. It's great to be with you and to join you with the podcast. Yeah, so the Lateran is the Pope's University because the Lateran Basilica is the Pope's church in Rome. It's a common misunderstanding. I think the Pope's Church is St. Peter's Basilica, but in fact it's the Lateran Basilica in Rome, and there's a university attached to that, hence it's the Pope's University. And I did a licentiate, which is an ecclesiastical degree, equivalent to our master's degree,
right?
I should say, with some more stringent requirements around language, and you do have to do a public defence, public lectures, those sort of things, differentiated. But it was a great experience to complete that degree. You're absolutely correct.
Oh, it would have been, and not too many people, I think, in Australia would have had that experience. So it sets you apart. Fascinating.
Yeah, certainly non-clerics. So as a layman, there's quite a number of priests who've done it. As a layperson.
Paul, today our conversation is about a liberal education and something that Robert Menzies was really passionate about and devoted a lot of his career as a state MP and then a federal member of parliament and, of course, Prime Minister for 18 years. He devoted a lot of his career to the expansion of universities in Australia and also the expansion of tertiary opportunities for Australian students, because of his belief in the good of a liberal education. So as the president of Australia's first liberal arts college, I would love to know more about Campion College itself, what it does and how it fits into this sort of concept of a liberal education.
Excellent. I'm more than happy to speak about what we do here at Campion, because it is very, very unique in Australia.
Yeah.
And absolutely. As you said, it's a first of its kind in Australia. There's certainly other institutions now and which are having liberal arts degrees and certainly the Ramsay degrees, which have appeared in 3 universities that are offering sort of similar types of degrees, and other smaller institutions have developed some liberal. The first and still only devoted, singularly devoted to the liberal arts education. And so it's modelled a lot on the classical idea of a liberal arts education, which is a very integrated degree. And as a modern liberal arts institute, we tend to focus more on the humanities. Yeah. So maybe we'll get into a bit more about sort of the liberal arts in a broader sense and historically. But we tend to focus on the humanities, although in our third year of our BA program, students do compulsory science as well to give that broad base. So a liberal arts education is broad, deliberately broad, but that doesn't mean it lacks depth, because in the sense that it's broad, it tries to go deeper into particularly in terms of the Western tradition, the great ideas, the great writings and so on of the Western tradition. The other thing that characterises Campion, which is very different to Australian and most contemporary universities, is that we do have a very much an integrated curriculum. So our core curriculum lasts for 2 years. So every student for those first 2 years of their 3-year program studies the same units. So in the broad areas of history, literature, philosophy, and theology. And the reason behind that is because each discipline informs the other. And to be a good historian of the ancient world, you really need to know the philosophy. You need to know the literature, you need to know their ideas about religion. And similarly with all the other disciplines. And we take that through the period up to the modern age. And so that's why, a student, after they've completed the degree here at Campion, knows really in great depth, the Western tradition in all its glory, but also all the warts and all, basically, of the West historically. But certainly the great works, the great ideas, the great debates, and so on, is what we attempt to study here. The only other thing to add that we offer at Campion is the classics. So sitting alongside that, some students will take on, ancient Greek and ancient Latin in our classics program. So we offer, as I said, a broad-based Bachelor of Arts and a Liberal Arts degree, the first and still probably the only of its kind in that sense.
Oh, it sounds fantastic. I think I could do with a couple. 3 years, is it?
Yes, 3 years. You could do the first year diploma if you only want.
Oh, I might look into that in my spare time. And how many students do you have, Paul, doing this?
So we've got about 160 students. Yeah. So what the idea of the college is very much based on the sort of the renaissance of liberal arts colleges that happened in the United States. So the US is like in so many different things, it has the best and the worst. It's eclectic, it's diverse, and so its higher education is like that. So You've got the prestigious, and you've got the basic. You've got the very best and the very worst. It's not as it's not as scrutinised. It's not as it's not as regulated. Certainly as the Australian higher education scene. And so there's a lot of these smaller liberal arts colleges, some very old and some quite new, that are mostly residential. So that's like us, we're residential. So students live on campus and are deliberately and intentionally, a community of learning. So not big, but really intentional of really knowing each student and sort of, I guess, that more traditional idea of, living on campus, living in a college, and, the Oxford, Cambridge idea of living in a college where you know all the academics can follow you, and so on. So that's the model we're based on, rather than the bigger universities that are just sort of have a monopoly in Australia.
Oh, it sounds like a very unique experience for Australian students to live on campus. It's almost unheard of, except for a very, very select few at universities across Australia, and that idea that the professors and academics would know you and you would know every other student in the classroom it's very different from the experience I had here at Melbourne University. I must say, not that there was a bad experience here, it was great fun, but quite a different one. Paul, so thank you for describing Campion College and where it fits in the sort of tertiary education experience here in Australia. You've started to paint a bit of a picture of this, but what is the purpose of a liberal arts education? And I guess I want to link this back to Robert Menzies and his view of a liberal education as the sort of education someone should get to become a good citizen, a citizen in a rich liberal democracy who can contribute not just to their own vocation, but contribute to the political discourse, to public life, and enrich society, and potentially be a leader in society.
Yeah, so Menzies is absolutely spot on that the role of a liberal education is certainly that, and in some ways I think he's harking back to the first liberal educators, namely the ancient Greeks, who had this idea of paideia, which was this sense of, okay, education is really about educating the whole person, and that an education in, an educated person, which was the goal of education, was physical, but it was intellectual, but it was also moral. It had a moral dimension as well, that they would be the citizenry of the polis that would result in a flourishing society. And so this vision of education really is the seedbed of the Western ideal of education all the way through. I mean, obviously it has some transformation. We have the marriage of the Greeks with the Romans, and then obviously with Judaism and Christianity, Athens and Jerusalem, and the explosion that means in terms of fruitfulness of the West. But But I think Menzies is spot on. So the purpose of this liberal education, I think, is twofold. So I think Menzies is a bit more practical. So saying, a liberal education is to form a person, a good person for the society. So the end is in some ways the society, the good of society, and that's very good. And there's probably even a deeper sense, and this probably comes about when the Greek idea of paideia is married to the Jewish and Christian more telos, the end that's in God, is to say that, a liberal education is in some way an end in and of itself, that it doesn't have a sort of utility. Well, it does have a utility, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is something greater than even that. That to be a liberally educated person is a good in and of itself. It's about the wisdom of God, the divine wisdom of learning about yourself in the deepest possible sense. So I guess there's that twofold aspect of the purpose of a liberal education. I mean, our motto here at Campion is education for eternity. So that's a, I guess, deeper sense of the telos of education being, far greater than any sort of earthly utility, but at the same time, obviously there's an earthly utility. So a good citizen is someone who is educated in freedom, is educated in the idea of what a good human life looks like, is educated in the basics of what it means to be a good citizen, and therefore can really participate in a democracy, and that's obviously useful and a good thing. So I guess that's a twofold thing. And even for us here at Campion, we've always got to explain in a very practical way, all those students and prospective students, parents who think, well, what's the point of doing something like this? Yeah. Is it going to get me a job?
Yeah.
And so,
will it pay
even on
the bills?
that practical level, will it pay the bills?
Yeah.
And it's sometimes a hard question to answer in the sense that, we're so conditioned by the idea that, you go to uni and it's a ticket to a particular career. So it's very vocational, very utilitarian.
Yeah.
Whereas a liberal education is far more broad, far more sort of idealistic, but at the same time extraordinarily practical. And, we always give the quote from Steve Jobs when he was talking about the creation of the iPad. And he said that he only employs liberal arts graduates to come up with these ideas, because if he employed the sort of computer engineers only, they'd just they'd just spin these narrow boxes. They wouldn't think outside the square. So I think a liberal education is practical in that sense. It can put a variety of things together that wouldn't necessarily go together. Not to be against specialisation, but sometimes a broad-minded individual can bring the disparate into a unitary whole.
And actually, I think in this day and age, there's probably never been a more call for people to be so broad-minded and to be able to be dynamic in their thinking. And I like your Steve Jobs analogy there. I have a quote here from Steve Jobs along those lines. He said, "It is in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the results that make our hearts sing." And for a technology entrepreneur, you wouldn't expect that. That's fabulous, sort of blue sky thinking.
And I think you're spot on. I think today more than, we always say more than ever, but I think it's very true, because whenever there's a sort of big problem, so just even to talk about the pandemic, for example, I think there was a real need for more people to think more broadly and to think of, okay, there's a pandemic, which is a real health issue.
Yeah.
But it was sort of crying out for people to be able to put things together to say, okay, if we're going to come up with a solution on how public policy is going to be looked at in light of the pandemic, we need people with a vision of society, of the human person, of the polis. That's more broad than, okay, let's try to prevent as much death as possible, or let's try to eradicate this disease at whatever cost. Yeah. It needs that. And I think every issue is like that, really. And every corporation is like that. It needs people to be able to say, oh, have you considered this? Or have you considered the past? Let's look at the past, to educate us for the now and the future.
And pandemic's a good example. In the end, we all became very familiar with epidemiologists and all the sort of forecasts and the figures that were relayed every day. How many tests, how many cases, how many deaths, how many hospitalisations, how many in ICU. But life is more than numbers, and that's where being able to think laterally and drawing on other experiences beyond your narrow field of expertise, for example, comes up with innovative solutions. And, yes, we can prevent a death or prevent a lot of cases, but how does that flow through to other aspects of society? And I think, well, we're sort of two and a bit years into it now, aren't we? So we can look back with hindsight and we'll be very, terribly wise. But in the thick of the moment, having people step back and say, there's more to life than preventing catastrophe. Sometimes life needs to be lived, and experiences through hardship aren't necessarily always catastrophic. But anyway, I hope those conversations can take place at Campion and beyond.
Yes.
Paul, you talked about the ancient Greek origins of liberal education and then through to Christian and Jewish history, and I wondered if we could pick that apart a bit more and explore how this liberal education evolved from the era of classical antiquity through to the medieval world, and then of course now to this day in Australia, in America with the liberal arts colleges, and even in Europe. It was no doubt full of the difficulties that you experience throughout history, but it's a fascinating history, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the history of is where you were talking in the Western tradition of education, and it is a complex history. And obviously, like anything, you can't just look at education on its own, but it's affected by all other events. But just to give an idea, I suppose, of the liberal education tradition, as I said, the Greeks were sort of the main proponents, and obviously with the Romans, basically the Hellenized world was very sort of clear on its idea of education and really laid the roots of Western education with this idea of paideia and the education of that whole person. And this, in some ways, clashed, but it wasn't always smooth, but it ended up really being a marriage between Hellenism and Judaism and Christianity that led to the flourishing of Western civilization, what we'd call in Europe, and then as Europe expanded throughout the world.
And that link with religion, well, Christianity particularly for obviously the Western world, the importance of monasteries and these were people who were utterly devoted to study their entire lives. That was it. And
the monasteries really preserved that tradition, that the Hellenized tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition, for the flourishing in the Middle Ages of and the beginning really of universities in the Middle Ages, which were liberal arts universities. They had the seven liberal arts, the classical ones, the Greeks, the trivium of grammar and logic, and the dialectic, and then rhetoric, sort of the foundational base of language, the ability to dialogue and think through things, and then the ability to speak, which was the crowning glory for the Greeks of paideia, was this citizen who could, in a sense, strut on the stage, and
art
be
of
virtuous,
rhetoric,
and everyone would respect the art of rhetoric.
Yeah.
So this was always at the heart of Western education, and remained so in the medieval universities, and the quadrivium of the mathematics and astrology and music and astronomy. So these were sort of formulated as the seven liberal arts, but it was more than that. And certainly as the universities developed in the Middle Ages, we see philosophy and theology as sort of the crowns of the university. So obviously a lot of the ones who went to the universities were clerics. Not all, but a lot were. And philosophy and theology was sort of those things that were studied after the seven liberal arts were mastered, and in a sense they brought the whole academic enterprise into a whole. But there was a real flourishing of the intellectual life in the medieval universities, and often it's caricatured. The Middle Ages were sort of backward, but it was really a renaissance. I mean, you just look at the art and the architecture and the learning that was happening, scientific learning, philosophic learning, not just theologizing. It's the caricature doesn't hold up. And then as the Western world develops, obviously you have further sort of flashpoints with the Reformation and the Renaissance first, but then the Reformation and the age of the Enlightenment, which sees a change really in Western education, which becomes more, I guess, more pragmatic, a bit more the Enlightenment, upholding reason. There's now a divorce between, one could simplistically say, Athens and Jerusalem, and so that faith is sort of pushed to the side in education, definitely in the universities, that science is upheld as the principal force of knowledge. And what I would see, some would differ, but I would see as one of the problems of the Enlightenment would have been that we do get the beginning really of a more hyper-specialisation, more rationalistic approach to education. It's not to say the idea of a liberal education sort of disappeared, but there was this sort of tension between a more sort of rationalistic, scientific, research-based approach to education and this sort of more liberal case.
And was that, Paul, because of the trends, the sort of philosophical trends at the time in the Enlightenment, a sort of emphasis on, more of a utilitarian outlook of life Yeah, certainly it comes from that. And it really was this sort of divorce between faith. I mean, it's the Cartesian, Descartes' revolution really in philosophy, which is the seed for the Enlightenment turning point, which Enlightenment brings about many wonderful things, but this was it was an epochal change really in the West, the Enlightenment, in terms of that. And funny and interestingly, the Enlightenment is sort of in some ways caused by Christianity, caused by the Judeo-Christian outlook, and in a sense the Enlightenment separates itself from Christianity just naturally because of it's not, most of the great Enlightenment thinkers were very devout Christians, but it was this sort of sense that, okay, I'm a devout Christian over here, but I'm a thinker over here. And it sort of divorces the two, and this is a big change in the West. And that sort of starts to plant the seeds of secularism in society, in Western society at least. That
absolutely
grown since then.
Great political revolutions. So there's big changes, and so for good and for bad and everything in between. This is what happens. But in education, this is obviously a big effect. And so even your Christian schooling and your Christian universities will become more specialised, and you'll have your theology faculty over there, and then your science faculty over there, and they never the twain shall meet. They won't sort of speak to each other anymore. So it is a fragmentation that occurs. And I would say that, just to sort of fast forward a bit, so in terms of the universities that develop and the educational systems that develop tend to be more sort of progressive in that sense. They tend to be more utilitarian, more focused on reason and rationalism, to the detriment of sort of the more romantic idea of education, the more poetic idea, the more artistic idea. They always remain in tension, so they're both there. But I'd say certainly in the West that the former trumps the latter, that the reason sort of trumps the poetic, and I think we live in that situation in Australia. I mean, the bigger universities are certainly more based on this, I guess, the German model, the big research model universities, and are far removed from a sort of strict, or more focused on a classical liberal education, formation of the person and a good citizen. It's more, let's know things to make the world better. That's how we'll make the world better, if we know a lot more about things.
Yeah, and so to Australia, Paul, we started out in our modern history as a British colony, and our universities developed in that 19th century environment, but they always started off as much more vocational than their British brothers and sisters, didn't they? We've never really had in Australia until Campion that kind of liberal arts tradition, the liberal sort of education tradition. We started off quite differently. Obviously, because we're a much newer in terms of our Western culture in Australia. We're a much newer country. Can you talk about how tertiary education evolved in Australia, particularly as it relates to liberal arts?
Yeah, so you're spot on. So Australia's education system has been more practical, I guess, more research focused, more okay. Let's educational system is there to make this country better, and we need an educated citizenry to make this country better. All very noble things, but yeah, probably a far cry from your more traditional idea of higher education. But I think we've become further and further removed from that over time, which is, basically following the Western world in many senses. But having said that, the bigger, those original universities, although they were perhaps more focused on the more pragmatic in some ways, they always had their arts faculties. Their arts faculties were really liberal arts degrees, and very strong classics departments and so on. And so that was always there. It was always still there. It was just probably wasn't, the raison d'etre of the institution, but they were always there and a very powerful and important aspect of the university life. And I would think really right up until, the last few decades that was the case.
Yes.
But I think really probably from the expansion of the universities and, the Dawkins reforms and so on, I think that's where we've seen, even that tradition that held pretty strong has sort of dissipated somewhat. So it's very, your classics, you're still around, but they're very small in comparison to the rest of the university. Your arts faculties are getting smaller and smaller. The basic thinking is, your arts degrees are useless. Let's reduce that more and more. So that's happened more and more in all our universities, really. That's been the trend of these last decades, which is, a real shame. But it's true. But our universities have never really had that specific focus of just a liberal education. But so, I think the current state of higher education in Australia, I think there is a bit of pushback on that. And, it's nice to see that happen. Even Melbourne University, where you're based there, is, there was that idea, okay, we want students at an undergrad level to have a more general degree before they specialise. The Melbourne model, which is really a liberal arts model in many respects. So it was great to see that. I think we're seeing that more and more. Most of our doctors who graduate now have got another degree before they go and do postgrad medicine, and I think that's a good thing. That's you have a more grounded, more rounded doctor is far better than a specialised one specialising when they're 17 or 18 into medicine and then, leaving and not knowing a lot necessarily about human life or other aspects.
Professions like medicine, which deal with fundamental questions of life and death, and obviously doctors interact with people at some of their most vulnerable moments, having that grounded background, that sort of understanding of the big, having at least thought through some of the big questions of life and this world and our culture and our way of governing and the way our society functions and how we all interact with each other. I think that can only be a good thing. I think the Melbourne model was a great idea. I'm sorry it wasn't here when I was at university. There's a sort of a sense, isn't there, that people should rush through their education and get on into the workforce. And, of course, there's a financial incentive for that to occur because educating yourself is really expensive and not working and just being a student is almost impossible for most people. So I'm not unsympathetic to that point of view, and it's just essential for so many people. But that seems a shame too, because you're only young once, and it's a great time before you've had kids and you have serious financial obligations ahead of you. It's a great time to delve into some of the big questions in life. And don't you think, Paul, too, as society changes, there's particularly I think with mental health as a sort of, and issues around mental health they're so much more part of our vernacular now. We're becoming more and more accepting that this is a sort of a part of the condition of life as we face challenges, and that you can sometimes have a mental health issue that's just, that's normal. We shouldn't stigmatise that. But having that liberal education behind you surely is helpful in asking some of the deeper questions about why are we here, what is our purpose, what is our duty to community, to society, and questions of faith too that a lot of people shy away from. But for those who have faith, that gives them great meaning. It doesn't mean we all have to be believers of a religion, but to have at least thought through those issues surely can only be a good activity to have engaged in.
Yeah, and absolutely crucial. And I think some ways our education system fails us in that, in many respects, to ask those deeper questions. So, obviously we're talking more of the I suppose, higher education, tertiary, but sure. I think it really goes back into your schooling system, that there's, we have a very much a system that's driven by results, and a year 12 exam system, which, to be frank, is sort of an appalling way to look at education in a broad sense. I'm speaking as someone who likes liberal education. I mean, it's so far removed from that. And I think there is we're setting our young people as absolutely driven, and they haven't even asked the question, who am I? What am I doing here? Why is there something, not nothing? These are big, deep questions that I think we need to ask, because it's part of who we are as humans. I mean, one of our heroes, and hero of all sort of liberal educators, is Aristotle, and he was really a psychologist. He knew the human psyche, the soul, and studied it, and he knew that every single act we do as a human, we do. What is our motivation? To be happy. That's why we do things. Mm. And if we don't ask the deep questions about why I'm driven to be happy, what makes me deeply happy, what makes me deeply fulfilled, and the human person, it's incredible how science and social science shows that, we may think that money will make me happy, but, it's been shown that it actually won't ultimately make you happy. I
mean, there are
it'll help you achieve certain things.
Yeah. There's all these studies out there.
Most unhappy people. Yeah. People have the most money. They're just they die unhappy. So these are the questions that I think education, in a deep sense. Obviously, you need to know about other things, more practical things, but in a deep sense, I think these are questions that need to be asked. And how do you ask them? Really, you ask them by looking at. You don't just sort of say, okay, let me think about that myself now. You look at back. Okay, well, what did Aristotle have to say about that? Plato, or the great thinkers, what does Christ have to say about this? What does, Augustine have to say about it? You can, and when you're grappling with those and agreeing or disagreeing with them, that's where you can really come in. I completely agree with you on this whole question of, sort of, I guess, the mental illness, the fragility and so on. And I really feel, particularly for our young people at the moment, and, I see them, in my work, that just don't have the ability, or just never been exposed to asking some of these deeper questions. But I think certainly help. Obviously some mental illness, it's, they're mysterious and we don't really know. But to ask these questions, I think it's certainly not going to harm.
Indeed. And in a related sense, so we live in a liberal democracy in Australia, and my view, the lottery of life is being born into a liberal democracy, a free society. It's an incredible. It really is an incredible gift, and because in this day and age, we look at authoritarian regimes and the corruption of some regimes, and where the state trumps all other interests, particularly interests of the individual, and you see the outcomes at a human level of those societies. So we are lucky. Menzies thought that a liberal education was fundamental to a functioning democracy. He had I think, somewhat of an elitist view of it, that those who were educated in the university in a liberal education would be part of this elite group who could be leaders and understand the sort of deeper questions. But can you tell me how liberal education enhances a democracy, and that sort of the role of tertiary education in a democracy. Because I think people don't necessarily think that it matters. I think there'd be some people who would say, well, it wouldn't matter if there were, if a politician or a public figure has not had an education beyond just sort of the basic reading, writing, arithmetic.
Yeah. Well, if I gave you my really honest answer to this question, I would say that you'd automatically be disqualified from Parliament if you hadn't done a liberal arts degree at Campion College. But
that is a bit of self-interest there, Paul.
Yeah, a bit of self-interest, but also I think there's some truth to it. But look, I think they're deeply, and this is where I think Menzies is spot on, and you're right, maybe it's that slightly elitist understanding, but.
And of course, challenges the Dawkins and Gillard, challenges those Dawkins-Gillard reforms, which are really, so-called democratising universities, but then making it probably
goes back. Yeah, and I think this is where, again, I suppose if we talk about it in the broader sense of, education right through, because I think that's important. So in some ways they can be separated, but just in the basic principle of it. So if we look at the word liberal is obviously connected to the word to be liberated, and the whole notion of freedom. So democracy is really about freedom.
Yeah,
the freedom of a group of people together to decide how they wish to be governed, within a certain system. And so liberal democracy, as you very and rightly point out, is a good system. You compare it to the others, or the least worst system. But it's very, it's a great, and we are blessed to be living in a place like Australia. But it's not by accident. So it's to have a liberal education educates us in the proper sense of freedom, I think, in its most classical sense. And I think that's really important. So it's not liberation for its own sake. Because if it's liberation untethered from anything, if it's just freedom just so I can do whatever I like, that's just adolescent freedom. That's just, okay, when I'm 18, I can do what I like. And that's a true sense of freedom. It's a real and objective sense of freedom. But it's one that has a lot of poverty associated with it, and it's not the richest, fullest sense of freedom. The freedom must be connected to responsibility, must be connected to truth, really, must be connected to the good, the noble, the virtuous. And a liberal education asks the questions about, okay, first, to be liberally educated, I need the tools in order to think. So I need the grammar, I need the logic, I need the rhetoric, I need the mathematics, the science, the history. I need those tools, but what are they for? So a liberal education says, this is what they're for. This is what excellence looks like. This is what nobility looks like. This is what goodness looks like. And it's not to be necessarily completely prescriptive about that, but it's to say, okay, why is a liberal democracy, why is democracy good? It's to really ask those questions. It's to ask, well, what sort of citizenry is a good citizenry for a democracy? What does it mean to lead a good life? Why should a democracy encourage a good life rather than a bad life? These are big questions that, I think a liberally educated person would be honestly fully able to answer, but at least be aware of the questions and have some tools to answer them. So, and this is where I think Menzies is spot on, that a liberal education is crucial to a liberal democracy, because otherwise, and I think this is a problem of the West at the moment, is that we're so fragmented that there's just no notion of really what good is. It's so partisan, probably less so in Australia, but if you look at some places, it's very partisan. And so if there's no shared notion of the good, or no shared notion of what an educated person is, or no shared notion of anything, then it's very hard to have a functioning system, and there can be some risk. And I think, we haven't got time to go into this today, but that whole question of social media and all that, I mean, people use social media in a way that suggests to me that we do need a liberal education and a renaissance in it, because it's just shouting at each other without a lot of reasonability, without a lot of shared notions of good. So I think I think it's crucial to a democracy.
It sounds like Jack Dorsey, he's the founder of Twitter, he needed to take a leaf out of Steve Jobs' book perhaps when he was creating Twitter.
Completely agree.
Look, Paul, there's a lovely quote here from Menzies I wanted to read out that absolutely speaks to what you've just said. He said, without minds that were informed, toughened by exercise, broadened by inquiry and fearless in pursuit of the truth, they could never hope to have spirits untrammelled by blinding ignorance or distorting prejudice. Freedom would never be gained without discipline, which was based on an intelligent understanding of the fact that order and unity were essential if the liberty of the individual was to be reconciled with the rights of other individuals. And there's a lot in that to unpack, but I think really
that's beautifully
really
encompasses that.
Yeah. I wanted to finish our conversation today, Paul, by asking you about something that Professor Greg Malouche of the University of Wollongong, who's a friend of the Robert Menzies Institute and has participated in our conference last year, he argued that Menzies saw universities as something amounting to the new church, and given the development of liberal education and its connection to Christianity and Judaism, there's definitely something in that. Do you think that, and given the previous things we've discussed, do you think universities are more important than ever in an increasingly secularised world?
Yes, I think so. I mean, just to mention Professor Malouche, he's actually on our academic board, so he's a good friend of both of us.
Great.
So he's great. Great. So I think universities, this is one of the key issues of today for democracy in the West, but even, say, in Australia, is the fact that a lot of the institutions that supported democracy and in a sense, helped us to share a vision of the good have dissolved and have become far less an influence. And including the universities have got bigger, but in some ways I think their influence has sort of, in some ways, waned a bit. There's a sort of natural suspicion of universities for some people. Of course, they'd teach that in a university. They've got no connection to the world, or, what's this crazy idea now coming out of the university? There's a lot of trust issues, and this is across a lot of, I think it's what was Burke's, there's the little platoons in society that are needed for a functioning democracy. You need the church, you need strong civic institutions, a strong scouting movement, or the Rotary clubs. You need good political parties. And all of that, and people don't join those things anymore, or they're suspicious of them.
Yeah.
And so we've become far more atomised as a society, far more individualistic, and far less tethered to things that would have a shared notion of the good. So the churches have waned, the influences of churches have waned. There's lots of different reasons for this, but I think the society's become more and more individualised, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a fruit of the Enlightenment, but I think we've gone too far the other way.
Yeah.
And there's the little platoons have gone. And I think there's a shared idea of the nation still, and we still see that with, our shared, particularly in Australia, for sport and things like that, and, Anzac Day still and things like that. We have that shared notion. Maybe a little bit with our states still, clear after COVID.
Yes,
but
particularly in WA.
Apart from that, there's not a lot of shared values or shared institutions. So these little platoons that I think are so vital have gone away. And I think Menzies seeing the universities in some ways as a new church was very idealistic, but I think it's a bit like that, to say that, okay, we need these educational institutions to provide that shared notion of the good. Not to say that we all have to share exactly the same notion, but the good, for example, of, free expression, or the good of being able to have a debate with honesty, the good of the dignity of the human person. These things, we've lost, I think, and so I think this notion of Menzies has a certain truth to it, but I don't see the universities at the moment as certainly fulfilling that role. And one thing I probably haven't mentioned so much, but one of the problems in Australia, I think, for our higher education system is it's too much the same. That, 90% of our higher education students go to the same university, basically. So it's, they're all regulated the same. They all have the same degrees. They're more or less the same administrators. They're all public. And I think that we lack that diversity but anyway, that's probably getting off topic, but I think that's, to see these big, almost mini cities as churches, I think we're a far cry from that, but I appreciate the sentiment. I think it's a good one.
Oh, that's a really interesting note to end on, Paul, because it of course presents another podcast. The diversity of our tertiary education sector, and looking, say, to our friends in the United States, where they do have a much less regulated and diverse higher education sector. I mean, there'd be a lot in the history of how universities developed in Australia. We're a smaller country than the United States, Britain, so we have a smaller market. But I look forward to that conversation next, Paul. Thank you so much for joining.
I'd be happy to come back.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the Afternoon Light podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. It's been an absolute pleasure, Paul, to have you on.
Absolute pleasure for me too. Thanks, Georgina.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.